like people to introduce each other, African style. Okay. So tell me how you want to be introduced. No, we don't like to talk about ourselves. What do you think? Or not? Dispense with it. That's why I'm saying we could introduce each other. Would you like to be introduced? No, it's all right. Let me not confuse things. No. So you have to use these things. Something like YouTube.
I'm being reminded of the time even before I begin. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Morning.
I have a terrible cold, but I'm going to push through and you're going to listen. And we're going to do our best to get this session going. My name is Natasha Kimani. I am a Kenyan. I am a feminist. I am a lawyer by profession. I am an Academy Fellow at the Chatham House, Royal Institute of International Affairs. With me is an amazing panel. There was a mix-up that the entire panel was from South Africa. No, we are not. We are from diverse parts of the continent, east, west, south. So without further ado, I'll let my panelists introduce themselves in the sense that I will just say their names and we'll get them talking and hear what they have to say. To my left is Mandipa Ndlovu, a friend. So it's great when you have a friend to discuss a few things with. Please tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi, Natasha. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this panel this morning. I'm sure it's going to be a great discussion. So as Natasha said, my name is Mandipa Ndlovu. I am an African that holds a Zimbabwean passport. I am currently a Mo Ibrahim Scholar at the School of Oriental and African Studies, doing my second master's in violence, conflict, and development. I hold previous degrees in a Bachelor of Social Science and International Relations, Gender, and French from the University of Cape Town, as well as an honors degree in Justice and Transformation and a master's in Justice and Transformation from the University of Cape Town. I am a decolonial feminist. I believe that all lives matter for Black people, and I believe that Black voices are grievable. So yes, I hope we could have a meaningful discussion. Thank you.
Mandy. Mbalenle Matandela, please tell us a bit about yourself.
Okay, so I am Balentle Matandela, and I'm a South African / African feminist. I identify as an African feminist because I think our destinies are essentially the same. I was at the University of Cape Town, and I did an honors in gender and transformation. And during that time, there were lots of protests on the campus. So I was involved in the Words Must Fall movement and the Fees Must Fall movement, and I was part of informing the theory behind the movement. So essentially, I am here at Oxford right now as a Rhodes Scholar to continue disrupting that legacy in a different way. And I am currently looking at how social media impacts African feminism and how it broadens the reach of the theory, but also there are some limitations on social media that hinder and affect the way in which feminist activism plays out on social media in Uganda. And today I am looking forward to being on this panel, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Our last speaker needs no introduction, but I'll introduce her anyway. Professor Mina Mama, please, let's hear what you have to say.
Hi, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I have this opportunity, and I have to say I'm thrilled to be on this panel. I feel very honored, not least because I designed that program that you both did, that master's program. And of course, I was at the University of Cape Town for about 10 years and left that program there. So it's, as a migrant academic, it's very heartening to actually be able to connect with former students, because that's something we don't enjoy as much as those who stay in one place. So I'm a university professor. I frankly teach feminism, feminist studies, as a methodology for transformation and knowledge development and liberation.
Thank you. Professor Mina, there's something you said during our conversations that struck me, that you don't believe in the term empowerment. Oh. I'd love to hear why, and maybe for our audience, why you don't believe in women's empowerment.
It's malleable. Everybody uses it to mean different things, and it can be used to veil contradictions. Women want power. What's empowerment? We're the same as men. We want to be respected. We want dignity. I'm not against empowerment. I just think that the way it has been pursued is inadequate, primarily through microfinance and microcredit. And I was actually delighted to hear Linda's keynote, because I don't know why it is that gender and poverty is supposed to be addressed through micro. We want to think bigger. So I think that's one, but there are many, many different elements to empowerment, and it's often used to deceive, so I'm critical of it.
Building on what you've said, Professor, you mentioned that the current state of radical feminism in Africa has built on the historical struggle by women in Africa. Tell us a bit about that and your thoughts on how this movement has been built on the backs of women who fought in the struggle in Africa.
Okay, well, I'll start with a personal note. I grew up in Kaduna, northern Nigeria. When I stayed at school and continued to pursue degrees, everybody told me I was a feminist. So I thought, wow. And I didn't want to get married at a young age. I wasn't conforming because my father and mother were very relatively liberal. It's all relative. So I started looking into it. And I'm actually a psychologist. My doctorate's in psychology and then organizational psychology. So I was delighted with the reference to the mind this morning. It's what we work on. I work on primarily on intelligence, on intellectual building. So feminism in Africa, absolutely. It's like every other major world philosophy. It either takes root in a context or it remains irrelevant. And I tend to argue that feminism in Africa grew out of the historic struggles of African people. During the liberation years, women's emancipation was intrinsic to the most progressive and militant of all our movements. And as was being said this morning, post-independence has been a big disappointment for many African people. The kinds of regimes we've endured and survived have been deeply disappointing. Decolonization has been a disappointment. And I understand gender oppression to be absolutely a manifestation of coloniality. Think about it. It was men who came largely from empire until very late on. Only men. They recruited Africans as conscripts and as forced labor into their military, and then much later into the colonial administrative bureaucracy. Women were not involved in the complicity that allowed the establishment of administrative regimes, which, we understand as having been largely about pacification. So my argument basically is that on the African continent, men were much more drawn into the collaboration because colonialism was a militarized and very gendered, masculinizing process, and it changed African men and African women. And we're not satisfied with the way it changed African men. And one of feminism's missions is to continue the struggle for decolonization and liberation, and including, obviously, the questions of our menfolk and masculinity, as well as what kinds of women does Africa need now.
Thank you, Professor. Mandipa, building on that, we had interesting conversations about the whiteness of feminism, for lack of a better word, and how there's a lack of intersectionalism when we talk about feminism, because when we talk about feminism, most of the time, we're talking about white feminism. And a majority of the time, there's a perception, actually, sorry.
Thank you.
That feminism actually is for the sole protection of white women's rights. And sometimes that women of color are meant to fade into oblivion or just cope or align themselves with movements that do not relate directly to them. And Mandipa, you're very passionate about decolonizing feminism. Let's hear more about that and how we can do that.
Thank you. So for me, feminism is very simple. feminism for me is intersectional agency. So by the intersectional part of it, I refer to Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, where none of us in this room are either completely oppressed or completely privileged, right? And we need to address that intersectional aspect of it. The agency and why I'm a feminist is because it allows us to explore that intersectionality. But unfortunately, for me, the main narratives of feminism have been entrenched in the first, second, and third wave of feminism, which, if you look at the first wave, was for the right to vote for white women. Black women did not have the right to vote at that point. The second wave is industrialization. Where were Black women at that point? And you continue into the cyber revolution, third wave. Black women were not included in that either. So for me, in approaching what could be, after 2012, the fourth wave of feminization, which focuses a lot on sexual violence and gender-based violence against women, we need to stand up and write our own narratives for once as African women. A lot of our narratives have been dictated to us. A lot of the narratives of feminism have not been allowed to organically grow on the African continent, mostly because it's reactionary. And that for me is problematic. The reactionary, the reactiveness of African feminism, what causes our resistance, what fuels our anger, should not be the main force of the movement. We, for once, should stand up and say, let us attack this problem, not as a reaction, but as a movement towards our own equality. And, you know, you look at movements like the Me Too movement. It only gained traction when the white women spoke up. Black women had been saying these things for years, but it was seen as a farce, as a myth. And that, for me, it irks. Whose voices are grievable? Whose voices are grievable within the feminist context? You look at African feminism, Professor Amina Mama has just said, and I believe this to my core, that it's highly militarized, highly masculine. The hypermasculinity and the violence of that has been what has fueled our resistance. For how long is our resistance going to be reactionary?
Thank you so much, Mandy. I'll just, by a show of hands, and not from Kenyans, who has heard of Wangari Maathai? Not bad. Just building on that, Mbalia, I'm going to ask, and this is just recently we lost an icon, Winnie Mandela, and we saw that if it wasn't for South African women, Winnie would have died being vilified, a villain, a monster. South African women reclaimed her story. And how can we ensure that, for example, in Kenya, Wangari Maathai is a myth? A lot of young people don't know who she is or what she stood for. How can we ensure that women are not erased from the struggle, from history? Because history is clear that women have been part of the struggle. Sometimes they've been the backbone of these struggles. How can we ensure that we continue raising their names and the flag of these women? What can we do to ensure that they do not lose their place in history?
Okay, so I disagree a little bit with Mandipa. I think rage is a powerful energy. It's a useful force. And the rage in which younger feminists and even, I guess, feminists across generations online, when they started the I Am Winnie campaign or I Am Winnie Mandela campaign, they were enraged by how the media had slandered Winnie Mandela and assassinated her character and completely erased what she had done for our liberation movement. And I think this even started during the transition. It was nothing new, but you would think that because the country has moved on, and because with discussions about decolonization and discussions about the role that women played in the liberation movement, and the fact that like the youth are drawing from Winnie Mandela's like her words, her strategies, her just her spirit. People are talking about how her spirit has magnified. Like she didn't die, she magnified. And I think that African feminism should be a political movement to rewrite the stories that were systematically erased. It should be a movement that is liberating our history from the male gaze or the white gaze. And that is not reactionary. It's actually just enabling women to radically exist in our history books and to radically inform our intellectual traditions, our forms of resistance. So I think that this is political work that we have to do. Whether you are Kenyan, whether you are Ugandan or South African, this is political work. Writing is about freedom. So we need to free our histories from the gaze that the people who were writing our history decided to use and erase the people who really contributed to our liberation. To also answer about kind of the strategies that we used, and this is linked to a lot of the thinking that I've been doing about, feminism and like how women are claiming space online to bring these conversations to the fore. So I think Rage is very impactful because that mobilizes people online. It mobilized people through the like a 1 in 3 campaign, like I am 1 in 3. People came out and shared their stories of sexual violence. And when I think about mobilization around sexual violence, Me Too, like, I'm on the continent, so like hashtag like 1 in 3, like for South Africans, that really meant something. That really was a form and like a way in which we were claiming space online for our narratives about sexual violence. And in the same way, I guess Winnie. We needed to claim that space and to find sisterhood. And I think the digital space is allowing sisterhoods to exist beyond borders. And that is another way in which we can do the political work that needs to be done to have histories that reflect the power of women and the effect of women in our liberation histories.
Thank you. Professor Amina, building up on what Bali has said, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can continue ensuring that our history is not diluted. But also, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, I have with me, I hope everyone will download it, her most recent article, The Power of Feminist Pan-African Intellect. And you offer amazing insights on how we can ensure that African women are published, that there's space for research. How can we ensure that the space is increased and that African women get to be heard, and not just heard, seen as well? Because often we hear about them, but they're never given room to sit. The floor is yours.
Thank you for that question. I do think of feminism as a politics, as a philosophical movement, as a toolkit, because I'm a researcher primarily and a teacher. So I work a lot with developing analytics for demystifying how our societies are structured and organized, deconstructing how organizations reproduce power, our bureaucracies, for example. I describe them as an edifice of complicity. They were set up during colonial days, like in a little mini apartheid structure all over the empire. They were peopled largely by local men, but their purpose was not to deliver to the people. It was administrative pacification. It was maintaining the peace, which we used to experience as conquest when it was done by armies. So, militarism bureaucracy, the administrative legacy, what I call the edifice of complicity, is very stratified around gender and class. And what we've succeeded very well in doing is adopting capitalist, driven by the intrusion of capitalism, class formation. So our societies are stratified and divided, and feminism, as I understand it on the continent, I want to just come back a little and say you're describing what we used to call imperial feminism and colonial feminism. These two exist. I invented the term imperial feminism because very late on empire, when it was realized that the mission was actually beginning to fail in both Britain and India, both in India and Nigeria, a lot of colonies, they began to bring wives out, and those wives formed women's groups. In Tanzania, there's very good history on it, documented by a late colleague, Susan Geiger. The first national women's organization was formed by, I think it was Earl Grey's wife. Why? Because they were worried about all the Kenyan women running off and joining Mau Mau, Land and Freedom Army. So it was introduced to domesticate and calm and groom as an elite, a feminine elite suited to be the wives of the gentlemen who had been recruited into colonial governance. So, so in that sense, feminism can be used by anyone. I mean, I've even heard Republicans in the US saying they're feminists, and I'm saying, wow, this is new. And yes, we have neoliberal feminists, we have corporate feminists, we have femocrats, feminist bureaucrats. So there are many, many kinds. But on the continent, I'm arguing really that our particular history of it is a global thing, and everyone uses it different ways. But on the continent, the emergence of feminism is located in our own historical and material conditions, in the liberation movement. So our discourse came via socialist feminism, which is also intersectional. It's a class project as well as a gender project. And via the diaspora, and South Africa, it becomes an anti-racist project. Now, in Nigeria, it's not about race at all. So the intersections of power are differently organized, differently configured. So we might not target race, but I can assure you there are plenty of things I target at home. Violence against women, child marriage, Boko Haram, getting away with it, the militarized failures of the state, etc., etc. Without a gender analysis, you can't grasp the conditions that are marginalizing and subordinating and perpetuating the exploitation of Africans. And this is intrinsic to the structure of capitalism. And I want to put this on the table because of the last session. So I was very heartened because this is an area I'm not in. I work in the academy. I do what I would call intelligence work. We try and build African intelligence, intellectual development, transformative ideas, whatever, decolonization. But there's the whole sort of global, I want to say black radical intellectual tradition now theorizes the birth of capitalism as racial capitalism. And we all know that without empire, there would not be capitalism. If you understand capitalism, firstly how brutal it was here, and then how it expanded across empire, we're talking racial, patriarchal, militarized capitalism, and that's a global phenomenon. And all of us have had to find ways of responding to it. And women worked with and in, killed and died for liberation movements where there were wars. In Nigeria, they tried to enter the political arena. Wonderful women like Mrs. Ransom Kuti. There was no space for women in the inherited and adopted political party structures for a long time. So I would say a decade after flag independence, women began to push all over again when they saw that they were not being adequately included in the supposedly post-colonial state, which I'm arguing ran itself and on restoration, sort of patriarchal lines. The focus of the nationalist thinking was that men had been emasculated. Well, I assure you, we didn't emasculate the men. So we're not going to be blamed and punished for it. You know, we were right there with you. We weren't emasculated, not what I call, I didn't emasculate. I work with, and I enjoy working with, and I raise my sons accordingly, and I adopt sons everywhere. Love young men, old men. But, you know,
Thank you, Professor.
So it's not only about feminism, it is also about what kinds of men do we want. I have a daughter too. I'm very concerned about what kinds of men, and I'm concerned about the way in the global order, gender politics is very dubiously appropriated. When George Bush can recruit women from Afghanistan to display as a justification for bombing the out of that country. We have a serious problem. So I will say feminism has been in the West and in lots of places is very badly misappropriated. So we need to be cognizant of our own historical trajectory and how we want it to be for us. And as I said, for me, it's a toolkit, it's a repertoire, and I think it's a it's a liberation movement that's picking up on some of what was left incomplete. So we deal with gender and class because it's the African majority, men and women, who capitalism is not treating well enough. I'd like for discussion to ask how this African capitalism can be improved, because in terms of money, I've been very involved in ratcheting the Global Fund for Women. I chaired their board for 10 years, and the project was to get Silicon Valley money and send it to women's movements across the world, and did that for a long time. They're still doing it. What we did for Africa was set up the Africa Women's Development Fund in Accra. Now, this is an organization which is deeply connected to women's organizations and movements all over the continent. But do African multimillionaires support it? No, we're still having to beg from the West. Having that fund means we can use the money independently. So, you know, it's like a cleanup. Laundering. I always see donors as laundering the worst aspects of capital. You know, that's fine. We welcome some laundry. When we'll take the money because we know what we want to do.
Thank you, Professor.
So the money thing, I want to know why African capitalism doesn't support structures instead of personalized individuals in a very feudalistic. I know Aliko from when he was a young man, by the way. We grew up in the same place. Why on earth aren't men catching up with this understanding that, you know, capitalists need to seriously invest in social development, education, and technology? Appreciated that.
Thank you, Professor. Before we open the floor for questions and just discussions, I have a final question for you, Mbali. And this is about organizing feminist movements online and offline, but more so online. And I'll give an example of Kenya recently, where we had a hashtag No More Manels KE. And this was because every time we switched on the television, there was no female speaker in any of the political discussions. Only when we were talking about gender politics is when the panel was all female and there was no single man involved. So at some point, we decided this is not going to continue. We ensured that we got a list of people who were available to have discussions. So that was one of our ways of reclaiming our history and reclaiming our space. And Wangari Maathai famously said, human rights are not things you comfortably ask for when you're sitting at a table. You have to fight for these rights. So how can we fight for these rights? Because sometimes I'm getting tired of being the angry black woman. And sometimes as we fight for these rights that we deserve, that's all we get painted as. Angry, bitter, single. I mean, and for African women, this is true. In fact, the greatest insult you can receive as a feminist online, as an African woman, when they discover that you're unmarried, it answers every single question about you. No wonder she's like that. No wonder she's aggressive. So there are layers to discrimination and spaces that we need to claim. And maybe this is also to the audience. 2 questions. How can we ensure that next year, that there's a man sitting here to ensure, is that necessary even, Professor? Yes, so no, sitting, yes. So is it necessary to get a man to sit here? I'd love to hear your opinions, but first, Bali, maybe you can tell us how we can organize.
So I think offline and online, like social media is a medium essentially. So it was created as a neutral medium, but the power dynamics are shaped by the people who use it. So you find patriarchy, the very same patriarchy you deal with offline is present online. And that works against women who are trying to liberate themselves, who are trying to push society to change these power structures. And the reason why your anger is policed or women are framed as being angry and bitter is because how powerful that rage is. It's a way of policing how that rage can impact society. Humor is equally as powerful in terms of ridiculing power. And these are some of the emotions that people who are trying to fight against change will use against freedom fighters. So I definitely think that organizing is, the strategies require emotion. They require reason. They require the use of language and the strategic use of language to mobilize people. So I think if you're asking me how do we organize, I think a lot of organizing can happen when we use our emotions and not like be scared to or shamed for using them, which is how people contain and punish people who use emotions. That's a way in which they punish you.
I think just to add on to what Mbali said, I completely agree. But a very important aspect to strategizing and organizing is funding. We need to federate as African women and fund ourselves because the men are not going to do it. It has been proven time and time again, women in political spheres are just not recognized as, potential, Men will go in, mediocre, probably half as qualified as a woman is, case in point, Donald Trump, just to name a few.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. And still rise to the top. We need to realize our own potential and invest in ourselves. It is time we do that. It is time we educate ourselves within feminist thought, which brings out what women are capable of and support each other. Because it's not just about funding, it's not just about the rage, it's not just the emotions that keep us going, but it's about the support once we're in those spaces. Women need to learn to support each other once we're in those spaces as well.
Thank you. Now I'm going to open the floor to questions, comments. Please state your name and what organization or university you're from. And if you don't want to state what organization or uni you're from, that's also fine. Your name is that gentleman over there. Yes, yes.
Hi, my name is Julian. Zimbabwean born, Oxford history alumni. So I have a question basically to Professor Dr. Amina Mama. I was interested in the idea of the gendered process of colonialism, and sort of like approaches this obviously as a man. I was just wondering how much in a contemporary post-colonial context should we consider the gendered process of colonialism and its continued presence in structures, in patriarchal structures today, but also the presence of similar yet differing patriarchal structures within traditional values and traditions, essentially. So are the challenges intersectional in a sense? And does it differ depending on tribe? My dad's the Zulu Xhosa, my mom is so these kind of gradients that I want to sort of get to the bottom of, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Inka Evans. I'm a Ghanaian, but I currently live and work in the Netherlands. I have a question, what's more of a comment that provokes a question. So, Amina Mama, you were talking about how in contexts like South Africa and perhaps Zimbabwe, occurrences like misogyny and war are more prevalent. So race is hypersensitized there as opposed to in other, African contexts. However, I wanted to comment on that and say, as a biracial woman myself, the concept of the privilege of light skin privilege in a number of African contexts is a real thing. And especially in an African context, it yields such a great socio-economic benefit, and it's not only tied into beauty standards, it's also tied into survival for a lot of women, which is, I think, Yes, which is at the core of occurrences and phenomena like bleaching, unfortunately. And I just really wanted to almost unravel that. Perhaps if one of the panelists would like to tackle that, I'm personally very interested in it.
I mean, sure. But so did the girl at the back. So I'm trying to get you everywhere.
It's difficult to moderate. Hello, my name is David Bradshaw. I'm not African per se. I'm a watered-down version from the Caribbean. Thank you. Tiny island called Montserrat, which is still a colony, alas. Yeah, just kind of sub questions, really. Perhaps to the chair, Natasha. Winnie Mandela was mentioned right at the outset of our keynote speaker this morning, Linda, who's here. Hello, Linda. Great session. And she said there would be no Nelson Mandela without Winnie. So my question is, was Winnie a feminist? If so, was she a saint to that end? And is feminism working in Africa today? Because as far as I can think, I can only think of one woman president, one woman who made it to the top. And if the goal of feminism is to bring women to the top, no, I can only I'm not saying that's a fact. I'm saying my memory is not the best, and I can only think of one, and that was the ex-president of Liberia until recent times. Right, that's me.
I'm going to be a bit biased because that is a Kenyan asking a question behind there. So I'll let the final question so we can take a set of more. What's your name and...
Okay, so my name is Debbie. I'm an architecture master student. I just finished this week. I'm from. Thank you. So yeah, I'm a Kenyan as well. So my question is to everyone, and it was kind of picked up on something, Amina, that you mentioned on kind of social development and intelligence building. So on the subject of feminism. So I wondered, is it something that you've done in the context where you're from, like the teaching and awareness on the understanding of feminism, and how has it been received by both men and women? And are you seeing sort of the effects of like maybe changing, because you mentioned that it's a lot of these structures came down through colonialism, and that kind of education would kind of act towards decolonization of this and of these structures. So I wanted to ask if if in practice of passing that, like, and teaching your intelligence, that you've seen a change in either patriarchal structures or in government or in businesses in Africa.
Wow, thank you. These are really great questions, and I was very happy to see Linda. Thanks for joining us, because I actually addressed a question to you just before you came in. So may I, before I respond? So the question I asked, people will correct me if I remember my own question, but I know what I want to know from you, which is I mentioned that we have a number of feminist philanthropic organizations, a Global Fund for Women, and then the Africa Women's Development Fund. And I expressed my concern that African capitalists, maybe billionaires, but were still very focused on self-help, our own relatives, our own kin. African men are generally very generous. It's a wonderful thing. But we're not giving systemic towards anything that can change systems, which requires movements of people. So I urge all those African philanthropists to put some money into the women's funds, in which you have actually accumulated over the decades a lot of development expertise. So the women who work for these organizations are out there with supporting grassroots women's initiatives. So it's a cross-class strategy. They're also doing culture. So I want our capitalists to support us. basically. So I know that will be ongoing business because the nature, the culture of philanthropy. Look, we got most of the money. I think in South Africa, I drew in about $5 million to do an intellectual transformation program that lasted 10 years. It's now spent, by the way. So the journal is suspended for now while we regroup. So you're right, the money's there. But to persuade, and I want to say educate our rich people, like everyone needs to be more intelligent these days, frankly. The world is very complicated. It is. No, neoliberal capitalism, we need to deconstruct what it is we desire. It cuts very deep. Look at it, even all the way down to what we desire and how that relates to the vast needs of the majority of Africans. We need to change the whole cultural thing. But that was my question to you. And I'd like to invite your comments on it. You do that first. No, there's no escape. Okay, so we were given a lot. Okay, I'll try and be quick. Thank you. What to take first? Indigenous culture and colonial culture. Look, I think all known civilizations are organized around various kinds of stratification, and gender probably as much, if not more, than class, because it cuts right across everything. So, as I've argued, the colonial regimes reconfigured gender in ways that exacerbated antagonisms between African men and women by co-opting men, excluding women, impoverishing women through the selective recruitment of men. All those economic, social, cultural, psychological processes had impacts. Now, the thing about specificity, I say imperialism was global, but colonialism is very complicated and it's very different in different places. So the meaning of gender relations under colonialism is different in terms of the interaction between whichever particular, because they were given free hand, the British administrators in our case, they did different things in different places. And in terms of gender, they were frankly confused. They didn't think about it. They focused on recruiting men because they came from a patriarchal economy that enslaved children and women in the mines, So they took that, exported it, locally people benefited, and the worst exploitation is gone global, and it's worked out in our places. So, but the role of traditional culture, it depends. I think some of our indigenous cultures were extremely patriarchal, feudal, and I would say northern Nigeria is pretty feudal. In terms of its gender relations. We still have polygamy, we still have child marriage, and I don't see our capitalist leaders challenging any of that. In fact, wealthy men they've reversed the laws banning child marriage, which the women's movement achieved. I mean, what kind of nonsense? So I say men are reactionary. They're reacting to the possibility of change. So I think, it depends which indigenous culture. One of the feminist projects is the recuperation of the good things in our cultures, which have been completely denied. So feminists engage with African men around a masculine narrative of what was African tradition. People are very selective about it. Frankly, we have a wide range of cultural options, and it's up to us to choose how we want to be in the future. So I say we need to, recuperate the various opportunities and make intelligent choices that will carry our continent forward. Culture isn't fixed. In fact, colonialism fixed it when it codified, in its own way, laws. Traditional law and custom is a colonial production between men, white and local chiefs. It didn't help ordinary people or women. So that's sort of the argument. And you need to look very carefully at different places to identify what's the good and what can we dispense with. And we all have ideas about that. So that's on the colonialism and the tradition. As for my Caribbean brother here, your comments are very welcome. I learned a lot from Caribbean feminists. I'll say straight up, you can hear and know that although, among my people I might speak differently, but I was trained in London, and I hung out with the Caribbean community. The Nigerians I knew tended to be elsewhere, and I lived in Brixton and Ladbroke Grove, but most Nigerians were living in Mayfair at the time. It was the peak of the oil boom. I stayed away from them because I couldn't quite cope with the sort of sexual culture that came with the oil boom, and became an academic. But I was trained a lot in places like Brixton Black Women's Group, which was early a Marxist feminist collective, the first black women's group, hence the need to deracialize, decolonize, make feminism our own. It started there, and I entered feminism not just through white women, although the education was there, but through Caribbean women who set up the most incredible programs across the Caribbean, which I borrowed from when setting up the Pan-African intellectual program. So Caribbean women are way ahead. I don't know about Montserrat, it is very small, but go to Trinidad and Jamaica and you'll find a very lively, vibrant feminist intelligentsia. The class issues are there, the race issues are there, but feminism tries to confront those and deal with them.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes. I think we have 2, but I'm pushing for 7. I'm reclaiming my time. Bali, I don't think I'm placed to speak about Winnie. I think South African women are doing it perfectly for us. Although I will say one thing. Winnie Mandela was not in a beauty pageant. She was fighting for the rights of people who were being killed. People's land that was being taken. I mean, when we're talking about struggle, I wonder how we always make it seem that the oppressed should have been saints. According to whom? I mean, I think we really need to change this narrative. So that's all I'll say. But Mbali, I believe your best place.
Okay, so firstly, I think whenever people speak about Winnie Mandela, they're always comparing her to Nelson Mandela. So firstly, Nelson Mandela isn't a saint either. And if you had been in the South African liberation movement, like oppression had forced you forced people into positions where they had to use whatever means to liberate themselves. And so the sinner kind of dichotomy is actually it's actually just a distraction from talking about liberation, and I think so. Let's talk about Winnie. Let's leave Nelson. There are 4 different Nelsons we can talk about, but I don't want to spend this panel doing that. So Winnie was fighting not only the apartheid government, but her male comrades within. And if it were up to them and not up to the women who she inspires consistently and to this day and energizes to this day, those men would have killed her and her legacy at the same time as she died, as she passed on. They would have just let her legacy kind of remain tainted by white supremacy, but also by patriarchy. And those are forces she was up against. They used kind of the structure of a family to oppress her as well. They took away her husband, and then she was led to kind of survive and with her children and look after her children in a place where she was banished. She couldn't speak to people. She couldn't engage with anyone, and that's a form of torture. So they tortured her in gendered ways in which her male comrades were not tortured, and she still came out and furthered the movement. She literally elevated the Mandela name. So we cannot speak about, I feel like we cannot speak about Nelson Mandela without speaking about Winnie, but not the other way around. And people tend to do that because of the patriarchy, but also because of the media, which has framed the story as Nelson Mandela went to jail. The story is there were people who kept the movement going, and Winnie was one of those people. And just to go address the race and colorism, that question that was raised by, is it Inka Evans? Yeah, thank you for that. So I've done a lot of research in 2 different contexts that have experienced colonization. One as a protectorate, the other slavery, colonization and apartheid. So I can say Southern Africa is hypersensitive and extremely racialized as a region on the continent. But I think tribalism is a manifestation of racism. and that is present across the continent. And I think colorism as well is a manifestation of racism, and so is Afrophobia. So racism is always at play, whether you can see the white human being or not. The structures are a function of racism. So I think feminism has to be anti-racist, no matter where we're operating from on the continent, because Afrophobia, tribalism, colorism, all of these things come from racism at the core. Yeah, just also to answer the question from Debbie. Yeah. So you spoke about like education and how what kind of evidence we have that our education, our feminist education, has worked. So when the Words Must Fall movement started, decolonization, decolonial feminism, it was a swear word. In public discourse, these were not the type of things people were debating about. Even intersectionality, people didn't know what that was, or intersectional feminism. So I think the effects of it is that people are talking about it daily. And we can't gauge whether it's affecting behavior as a whole, but we know that institutionally it's being integrated into intellectual traditions.
Yeah, I'll just give you less than a minute, literally less than a minute to just give us your final thoughts. Literally, the daggers that I'm getting sitting here, we need to wrap this up.
I'll make it very brief, because I think Bali and Professor Amina Mama have kind of summarized my thoughts as well. Just Debbie as well. Bali and I sitting here are a reflection and a product of what feminist education can do. It is both liberating, it is freeing, it is opening your mind. The most education I got at university was engaging with feminists. It was being decolonial. It was deconstructing narratives. And by the way, feminism and feminist concepts can be included in any sphere of education. So being intersectional is not just limited to gender. It's limited, spreads across class. It spreads across capitalism. It spreads across so much. And feminist education really is the best education that you can get. And as Mbali said, it shows in how people are starting to speak about issues now. And Uncle from the Caribbean, what can I say? Was Winnie Mandela a feminist? Because Natasha is almost kicking me under the table, I will say one thing that Mbali did not say. I will say, for me, she was the embodiment of feminism. She worked, she struggled, she resisted. She was everything that a feminist should be. So I think in the Oxford Dictionary, when we think about feminism, you should say, cite Winnie Mandela's life. Because that is who she was right until the end. Her daughter cried on a podium in anger. She cried because her truth was only told in her death. And we should make sure, going back to what I said before, how long will we be silenced? We must make sure our narratives are told while we're still alive, so that no one questions our feminism. No one questions what African feminism looks like. Okay, now she's squeezing me. No.
They've called it, the chair is in the room, so you'll have to forgive me. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just going to leave you with one thing. I hope you remember their names in all that you do. Wangari Maathai died in Kenya, a death, and we do not remember her name. There is not a single street that is important enough that is named, apart from the UN street, after Wangari Maathai. And I had a conversation, because I've worked in government, with people in the president's office back then, and they told me that she didn't ask kindly enough to get the position she deserved. So on top of struggling and fighting for our rights, she had to pacify patriarchy. So I'm just going to leave you with that. This was a fantastic panel. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone.